Mississippi has the Confederate flag as part of its state flag because we have the largest black population in the country. For the listeners who really want to understand how Mississippi politics has worked for as long as Mississippi's been a state and before, the central issue has been about race. That's been the axis point. And that's something that's consistent with a lot of other southern states, but what has made Mississippi the most extreme on any number of measures, and I think what has been the greatest contributing factor to us being dead last on sort of any positive measurement, is that we were the state that had the best soil for growing cotton, and therefore we had the planters in the state that enslaved most people. And then after emancipation, we had about 50% of the state's population was black. And after that, the political project that defined the next 100 years was, how does a state in which the white population is outnumbered both on a state level or at least in many parts of the state, how do you still maintain white domination? And so you see, Mississippi was the first mover on a lot of the tools of Jim Crow and disenfranchisement, and we were the ones that held on to them the longest, and we did so because from the perspective of those that want to maintain white supremacy, they worked extremely well. And so after the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the federal government really making a direct intervention in Mississippi, the project has become, how do we sort of move on from that, and how do we strip away a lot of the overt racism from our laws and our institutions and make it race neutral? What we have not done in that is really try to fundamentally change a lot of those laws and institutions in order to make them vehicles for equality and for justice. But what we've done is try to strip away any explicit mention or discrimination based on race. We've tried to sort of excise race as a stated motive in a lot of things. But in doing so, we have left many, many vestiges of the time in which, race that we were acting purely out of, purely in pursuit of maintaining white supremacy. And that includes the flag that we adopted in 1894, right as after the white redeemers had reasserted control in the state and had rewritten the state's constitution to include a poll tax and literacy test and all of that. That was the flag that they chose. It is the flag that still stands, but because we have sort of stripped a lot of our political conversations in the state, stripped race out of it, the calls to defend the flag have almost sort of more insidiously become, it's become harder to have a winning argument for those that want to change the flag, because when you say that this is racist and that it is offensive, others say, well, look, we don't discriminate on the basis of race anymore, and so how could it be racist? And so it's just become a very difficult issue to navigate and to reconcile. And I think, of course, I think that there are, I'm not trying to say that race isn't at the heart of people of the insistence that we must keep the flag. But in terms of political discourse and political organizing, it's very hard to have a conversation about racial offense and racial injustice as it pertains to that symbol, when a lot of people, the sort of white powers to be in the state have gotten comfortable sort of eliding the issue of race altogether. And so it puts us in this weird position where, these things were the people that designed the flag, people that designed a lot of our election laws and school system, they were not afraid of talking about race when they were making those decisions. But as we now try to talk about how to reform or do away with some of these things, it's almost like talking about race makes it ineligible for being considered in any pragmatic way. So a lot of the conversation has kind of, you take these sort of sidestep measures and talk about, not the intrinsic meaning of the flag and the history, but rather, the costs in terms of turning away business and solidifying the negative perceptions about the state, which, are not inaccurate in any respect. But we've had to kind of move past the heart of the matter in order to try to cobble together a winning political victory on that. And that's just an example. That is a very prominent, very visible example of something that I think is a central challenge across many fronts in Mississippi. That is just how do you take a political system that has always revolved on the axis of race and still does in people's private sort of voting choices and their political associations. How do you work to change institutions developed on that basis without talking about them, without acting upon them in a way that puts race at the center of it?
Jake, thanks so much for joining me. This has been really informative. I think Mississippi is a lot more complex than people realize. And, living on the south side of Chicago, this idea of race being just as central as, political party feels very familiar to me. And I think it's very informative to know how much that's going on in Mississippi.
Yeah, that's a good reminder that Mississippi, problems that we have seem to be of the greatest scale and scope of any state in the country. That they are certainly still part and parcel of national issues, national problems. Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Jake. And listeners, stay tuned for a conversation with David Baria, who is running for one of those 2 Senate seats. You want to save democracy, but you just can't seem to get off your couch. Well, you're in luck. Thanks to the magic of technology, you can now canvass for Democratic candidates from the comfort of your own living room. An organization called Red to Blue has a virtual canvassing program. It allows you to text registered voters and let them know about blue candidates, upcoming events, and of course, encourage them to vote in November. Red to Blue is targeting key districts that Democrats want to flip or hold on to. All you need is a computer and a couch, or a chair, or you could even stand if you want. They're not picky. Red to Blue will train you, they'll give you a script, and show you how to use their online dashboard. And they'll give you the voters to contact. The best part, this texting approach really works. It's not invasive, and it's more comfortable for people to engage with. It's especially effective with millennials, and we're not going to mention some gross stereotype about why that is. So, whether you're an introvert or an overachiever with too much on her plate, or just lazy, we're not judging. Virtual canvassing could be the activism you're looking for. To get started, just go to redtoblue.org to sign up. That's RED, 2, BLUE.org. I'm here in this segment with David Baria, who is running for the U.S. Senate from Mississippi. Hi, David.
Hi, Kellen. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks so much for joining me.
No problem. Glad to do it.
Great. So I know you have a really compelling story about why you first got into politics, and I thought maybe we could start there. If you could tell our listeners a little bit about your background and why you first got into politics.
Well, in terms of background, I grew up in a small community down in deep South Mississippi, just north of Pascagoula. The little community was called Escatawpa, and I was the son of working people. My grandparents were working folks as well with, limited education. Nobody in that group of adults in my life had ever graduated from college. And I went to Southern Mississippi and got a degree, and then I went on to Ole Miss Law School and got a law degree. Met my wife there, my future wife, and we moved to Jackson, Mississippi and began practicing law and raising our family. We had 3 children under 3 at one time, and we were working a lot. As our children got older, they were in Jackson public schools, and we were big proponents of public education in Mississippi. And I began talking to my wife about moving back to the Gulf Coast. That something about the salt water just sort of beckons to a boy who grew up down that way. And it took me quite a few years, but I finally talked her into it. And the deal was that she got to choose the place that we lived. So instead of moving back to my home county, we moved to a county to the west, Hancock County, in a little town called Bay St. Louis, which is about 40 miles east of New Orleans, Louisiana. And we had a great place down there. We had an old house that was built in 1870, and we were right on the Gulf of Mexico. And for about 17 months, all was really wonderful. And then Hurricane Katrina rolled through in August of 2005 and wiped us out. Took our home, everything that we owned, as it did with a lot of my neighbors. And my law office down on Main Street in Bay St. Louis went underwater. And so, we were like everyone else down along the Mississippi Gulf Coast just trying to recover. And about a month after that, my son became very ill, and we didn't know exactly what the problem was. He was hospitalized, and he spent several days comatose at the University Medical Center in Jackson, Mississippi, and then he died. And we didn't learn until afterwards that he had rabies. He was the only person in the United States to die of that disease in 2005, and the first person to die from rabies in Mississippi since 1947. It's virtually unheard of these days. But in the aftermath of those two big life-changing events, my wife and I decided that we were going to rededicate our lives to what was important to us. And my wife was really involved in making our county greener and rebuilding and, sustainable and using green technology and that sort of thing. And she formed a nonprofit that focused on that and recycling and on making greenways. And she raised money to buy planters and planted lots of flowers around downtown Bay St. Louis. And so that's sort of the path she took. And the path I chose to take was to get involved in politics and to run for office and represent my community through this rebuilding effort. And so in 2007, I ran for the Mississippi Senate. And I ran against a person whose family founded the county, and he had thousands and thousands of relatives, and he was a 16-year incumbent, and there were 2 Barias in the county, my wife and I. So it was a real long shot, but I ended up winning. I served 4 years in the Senate and then ran for the House of Representatives in 2011, was elected, and then ran again in 2015 and was elected once again in a district that votes about 75% Republican. So that's sort of my backstory, and that leads us to where I am today.
And you're still currently in the House of Representatives right now, and you're the minority caucus leader. The House of Representatives in Mississippi is still overwhelmingly Republican. Do you find that you're able to have an impact, to make things work? What does that look like right now for you?
Well, I think it's probably hard for folks to understand unless they have the inside baseball sort of view. But first, let me say that when I decided to run for the House in 2011, the Democrats were in charge. We lost the House in 2011, and so I moved from being in the minority in the Senate to being in the minority in the House. And then in 2015, it got worse, and our Democratic leader in the House was actually beaten in 2015. So when we came back in 2016, there were 47 Democrats in the 122-member body, and my colleagues elected me as their leader. And Mississippi has the second largest legislative black caucus in the country. Of the 47 Democrats in the House, 37 are African Americans. And so I'm honored to have been elected by my colleagues to be their leader, and I've served in that role since. And yes, we can be effective, but we have to build coalitions to do that, and we have to be very, very organized and disciplined in terms of how we message and how we vote. And one prime example is the Speaker and the other leaders here at the Capitol, all of whom are Republicans, were very tired of being criticized for not funding our public education formula, which we call MAEP, Mississippi Adequate Education Plan. And they had chronically underfunded it for 7 or 8 years. So instead of trying to find the money to fund it, they decided they would just change the formula from an objective formula to a more subjective formula so that they could decide what they thought was the appropriate amount of funding each year. And so we organized ourselves, and we got help from outside the Capitol as well, and we talked to a lot of Republican members who were pro-education, and we offered 17 amendments to the bill when it hit the House floor. Every one of them failed by the exact same vote because Republicans were told don't vote for any Democratic amendments. But we made our point. We had about a 4-hour debate. It was partially televised. We had all the press here. People were paying attention. And so we lost that vote narrowly, but the opposition to that rewrite grew. And so as the bill moved to the Senate, we were able to continue that fight. And I think 7 Republicans in the Senate ended up voting with the Senate Democrats, and we killed that bill. So that's the way that we can be effective